Canada is often seen as one of the safest countries in the world, known for its quiet towns and peaceful communities. But even here, there are stories that reveal a much darker side. In this podcast-style true crime compilation, we explore 5 chilling cases from across Canada, shocking murders, mysterious deaths, and crimes that left lasting questions behind. From disturbing acts of violence to investigations that gripped the nation, these are 5 more haunting true crime stories from Canada. London, Ontario, in the late 1960s, was a city that many believed to be safe and calm, with tree-lined streets and bustling local businesses. But beneath its seemingly peaceful surface, a predator was silently prowling. Gerald Thomas Archer, a man known to his neighbors as polite and unremarkable, had a history of criminal behavior dating back to the 1950s, including theft and breaking and entering. On January 31st, 1969, Archer struck for the first time that we know of. His victim, 62-year-old Jane Woolley, worked as a chambermaid at the London House Hotel on Dundas Street. She was diligent, friendly, and trusted the routine of her daily life. A few days after she failed to appear for work, her friends and police discovered her apartment on York Street. She had been violently attacked, and some of her belongings were missing, signaling that the crime was more than a simple robbery. Investigators collected cigarette butts found at the scene, small pieces of evidence that would later prove crucial, but at the time offered few leads. The murder shocked the city. The London police struggled to connect the dots or find a suspect. The public was left with a deep unease, knowing that someone was capable of committing such violence in plain sight. Archer had vanished into the everyday rhythm of the city, leaving behind only fear and unanswered questions. This first murder marked the beginning of a series of attacks that would terrorize the community and challenge law enforcement for years. For almost 2 years after Jane Woolley's murder, London, Ontario remained tense, but the killer seemed to vanish. Gerald Thomas Archer returned to a life that appeared normal. He married in 1967 and had a child, blending into his neighborhood while quietly harboring violent impulses. His criminal record, mostly for theft and breaking and entering, gave him experience in evading law enforcement, and he continued to operate under the radar. Then, on September 4th, 1970, Archer struck again, this time targeting 57-year-old Edith Authier, a chambermaid at the William Pitt Hotel in Chatham. The attack mirrored the first. Edith was assaulted in her home, money was taken, and the brutality signaled a chilling escalation. Unlike before, the murder crossed city boundaries, moving from London to Chatham. Unfortunately, at the time, police communication between the two jurisdictions was limited. The similarities to Jane Woolley's case, age, occupation, and the violent nature of the assault were clear in hindsight, but officers were unable to immediately connect the murders. The second attack marked a turning point. A pattern was emerging. Archer was targeting women who were vulnerable in their daily routines, particularly those working as chambermaids. Each crime demonstrated planning, control, and a willingness to strike where the victims felt safest. The fear in the community began to grow as word of Edith Authier's murder spread. London and Chatham residents realized that a predator was no longer acting in isolation. He was roaming across towns, leaving a trail of terror that law enforcement had yet to fully understand. Winter had settled over southern Ontario, and with it, a growing sense of dread in London and surrounding towns. On January 23, 1971, Gerald Thomas Archer struck again, this time claiming his third victim, 57-year-old Belva Russell, a chambermaid at the Merrill Hotel in Chatham. As with the previous attacks, she was assaulted in her apartment. Most of her clothing had been removed, and money was taken. Distinctive elements that tied the crime to the earlier murders of Jane Woolley and Edith Authier. This time, however, Archer made a crucial mistake. Belva's common-law husband, Reginald Tomlinson, returned home shortly after the attack, around 2 a.m., and encountered a man fleeing the building. The sighting was brief, a fleeting moment in the dark hallway, yet it was enough for Tomlinson to provide the first detailed description of the killer. For investigators, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. After months of dead ends and frustratingly limited evidence, they finally had a tangible lead. Police immediately used Tomlinson's description to create a composite sketch. Investigators began canvassing the neighborhood, checking past criminal records, and reviewing previous unsolved murders. For the first time, the pattern connecting the chambermaid's murders became undeniable. Archer, who had successfully evaded capture for years, now had a face, a concrete presence in the investigation, and the net was beginning to close. The city, long paralyzed by fear, finally felt a glimmer of hope. Police knew that capturing this man would require careful coordination, but they now had the critical first piece of the puzzle. The chase that had eluded law enforcement for nearly 2 years was about to take a decisive turn. With Reginald Tomlinson's eyewitness description in hand, police intensified their investigation in the early February of 1971. Detectives meticulously reviewed local criminal records, comparing past offenses to the profile of the suspected chambermaid killer. Their attention soon fell on Gerald Thomas Archer, a man from London, Ontario, who had prior convictions for robbery and breaking and entering. Archer, outwardly ordinary and married with a child, had successfully maintained a low profile, but the combination of his criminal history and the eyewitness sketch made him a person of interest. On February 12, 1971, Archer was brought in for questioning. Investigators fingerprinted him, compared his features to the composite sketch, and conducted interviews. The turning point came when Reginald Tomlinson was brought to participate in a police lineup. The moment was tense and decisive. Without hesitation, Tomlinson confidently identified Archer as the man he had seen fleeing the scene of his wife Belva Russell's murder. This direct identification provided investigators with the first concrete link between Archer and the chambermaid killings, a breakthrough that sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the local community alike. Archer was immediately arrested and charged with the non-capital murder of Belva Russell. Though investigators suspected him in the earlier murders of Jane Woolley and Edith Othier, concrete evidence for those cases remained circumstantial at the time. For now, the arrest represented a significant victory for the police and a beacon of hope for terrified residents. The relentless hunt for the London chambermaid slayer, which had spanned nearly 2 years, had finally produced results. Police continued to gather evidence and re-examine the previous crime scenes, determined to build a full case that would connect Archer to the earlier murders. The city, long gripped by fear, now watched closely as the investigation moved toward a resolution, one that promised justice for the victims and their families. In June of 1971, Gerald Thomas Archer faced trial in Kent County for the murder of Belva Russell. The prosecution relied heavily on the eyewitness testimony of her common-law husband, Reginald Tomlinson, which had led to Archer's arrest. The jury listened closely to the detailed account of the fleeting encounter in the hallway, and to the evidence connecting Archer to the other crimes through patterns and prior offenses. Despite Archer's attempts to challenge the identification and minimize his connection to the murders, the case against him was strong and convincing. After deliberating, the jury found Gerald Thomas Archer guilty of the non-capital murder of Belva Russell. He was sentenced to life in prison, a decision that brought relief to the communities of London and Chatham, but did not immediately provide closure for the families of Jane Woolley and Edith Othier. Archer's arrogance and chilling statements during the trial hinted that he might be responsible for additional crimes, leaving lingering unease even after his sentencing. In 1985, after serving 14 years, Archer was granted parole. The man who had terrorized London and Chatham returned to society, moving quietly between towns in Ontario. He largely avoided attention until his death in 1995, at the age of 62, when he passed away from a heart attack. His body went unclaimed and was buried in a potter's field, leaving his final resting place anonymous, much like the unresolved questions that had followed his crimes for decades. Decades after his death, new information emerged. Archer's estranged wife and daughter revealed that he had confessed to killing Edith Authier. This confession, combined with modern forensic advancements, led authorities in February of 2000 to exhume Archer's body. DNA samples taken from him matched the cigarette butts found at the scene of Jane Woolley's murder in 1969, finally providing definitive proof of his connection to all three killings. The confirmation of Archer's involvement brought a posthumous resolution to these cold cases. It highlighted the persistence of law enforcement and the advances in forensic science that could solve crimes long after they occurred. The story of Gerald Thomas Archer remains a chilling reminder of how a single predator can exploit everyday routines, leaving a trail of terror in otherwise ordinary communities. It also underscores the importance of vigilance, perseverance, and modern technology in the pursuit of justice for victims and their families. Prince Edward Island in 1988 was known for its calm, close-knit communities, where everyone knew their neighbors and violent crime was almost unheard of. On November 12th, that peace was shattered when 36-year-old Byron Carr, a well-respected English teacher at Montague Regional High School, was found dead in his home at 24 Lapthorne Avenue in Charlottetown. To those around him, Carr was a kind, quiet man, devoted to his work and family. The discovery of his body shocked the entire island. Investigators soon learned that Carr had likely met the man who would kill him the night before, in the early hours of November 11th, somewhere in downtown Charlottetown. The crime scene revealed a violent struggle had taken place, and crucially, a message had been left on the wall reading, "I will kill again." This chilling note suggested the killer was not only brazen, but intended to continue a pattern of violence, striking fear throughout the province. In the late 1980s, with no modern DNA databases, the Charlottetown police faced an immense challenge in trying to identify a perpetrator who remained completely unknown, leaving the island with more questions than answers. The day Byron Carr was found, Charlottetown police quickly cordoned off his home, treating it as a high-priority homicide investigation. Officers and forensic experts combed through the house, documenting every detail and collecting physical evidence, including the knife and towel used in the attack. Witnesses were interviewed in the surrounding neighborhood, but very few had seen anything unusual on the night of November 11th. Investigators focused on Carr's last known movements, speaking with friends, colleagues, and anyone he had interacted with in the days leading up to his death. Police suspected that the killer was someone Carr had invited into his home, but without a name or description, leads were scarce. At the time, DNA technology existed, but was in its infancy, and there were no national databases to help match the evidence collected at the scene. The investigation was further complicated by the social climate of 1988, where members of the LGBTQ+ community often feared coming forward, leaving potential witnesses silent. Despite tireless efforts, the case quickly became one of Prince Edward Island's most perplexing mysteries, as the trail of evidence seemed to disappear into thin air. As the investigation into Byron Carr's murder stretched into the late 1980s and early 1990s, the case grew colder by the year. Charlottetown police maintained an open file, reviewing the evidence repeatedly, but the lack of witnesses and the absence of any solid leads left the investigation stagnant. DNA evidence collected from the scene, including skin cells under Carr's fingernails and traces on the towel, was preserved, but at the time it could not be effectively analyzed or matched to any suspect. Officers revisited the neighborhood multiple times, questioning residents about anyone unusual who may have been seen near Lapthorne Avenue, but memories faded and tips were sparse. The impact on the community was profound. Prince Edward Island had always been a place where neighbors watched out for one another, but Carr's murder introduced a chilling reality that danger could touch anyone. The LGBTQ plus community, already marginalized in 1988, experienced heightened fear. People who might have had information were reluctant to speak to police, worried about exposure or retaliation. The message left on the wall, above Carr's bed, stating, "I will kill again," became a haunting reminder of the killer's audacity and further intensified the island's anxiety. Over the next decade, investigators continued to follow any lead that emerged. Cold case units were consulted, and occasionally, tips came from outside the province, but they rarely produced actionable evidence. Police revisited Carr's personal connections, re-examining acquaintances, co-workers, and anyone who had been in contact with him in the weeks leading up to the murder. Despite these persistent efforts, the case remained unresolved, and for Carr's family, the uncertainty was unbearable. The preserved DNA evidence became a silent witness, quietly waiting for technology to advance. By the early 2000s, forensic science had progressed significantly, yet the isolated location of Prince Edward Island and the lack of national DNA comparisons still prevented a breakthrough. The case remained a painful reminder that even in small, seemingly safe communities, violent crime could leave long-lasting scars. The cold years reinforced the reality that solving Byron Carr's murder would require both patience and the eventual intervention of a scientific approach that did not yet exist. The fear and mystery surrounding the murder also had a psychological effect on the island's residents. Parents became more cautious. Students spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy at Montague Regional High School, and the wider community struggled to reconcile the brutality of the crime with the peaceful environment they had always known. For nearly 2 decades, the killer remained a ghost, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a community living in quiet apprehension. Even as time passed, Charlottetown police never closed the case. Evidence continued to be cataloged, and detectives occasionally revisited the investigation with fresh eyes, looking for patterns or missed connections. The hope that science might one day provide answers kept the case alive in both official records and in the minds of those who remembered Byron Carr as a kind and respected teacher. By the mid-2000s, new developments in DNA technology began to offer a glimmer of possibility, hinting that after decades of silence, the story of Byron Carr might finally have a resolution. After more than 3 decades, the investigation into Byron Carr's murder finally gained momentum thanks to advances in forensic science. In the spring of 2022, Charlottetown police partnered with a private company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. This technique allowed investigators to take the DNA collected from the crime scene decades earlier and compare it with public genealogy databases, looking for distant relatives that could lead them to the killer. By carefully building family trees from these distant matches, police could narrow their search to individuals who fit the profile. The DNA evidence pointed them to one key person, Todd Joseph Gallant, who also used the surname Irving. In 1988, Gallant was 21 years old and living on Prince Edward Island. Records showed that he had a minor criminal record from the previous year and had moved away from the island shortly after Carr's murder. Over the years, he had lived in Texas and Arkansas before returning to PEI in 2022. The same year, police began their genealogical investigation. Investigators began to track his movements, confirming that he had been in Charlottetown at the time of the murder. With the genealogical work supporting the DNA evidence, police felt confident that they had identified the correct suspect. They also reviewed old police interviews and witness statements to verify that nothing contradicted the emerging picture of Gallant's involvement. In January of 2024, authorities finally acted. Todd Joseph Gallant was arrested in the town of Surrey, Prince Edward Island, and charged with first-degree murder in connection to Byron Carr's death. A second individual was briefly detained during the investigation, but was later released as police focused entirely on Gallant. The arrest marked the end of a 35-year-long mystery, bringing the case out of the shadows and giving Carr's family and the island community long-awaited answers. The breakthrough was not only a victory for law enforcement, but also a demonstration of how modern science can solve crimes that were once considered unsolvable. DNA evidence, combined with meticulous genealogical work, had transformed a decades-old cold case into a live investigation. Police emphasized that while the arrest brought clarity, many questions remained, particularly regarding motive and the circumstances leading up to Carr's death. The community responded with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Many residents who had lived in fear for decades now had a name and a face to associate with the crime. The LGBTQ+ community, in particular, found some comfort in seeing justice pursued, even though the events of 1988 had left lasting scars. For Byron Carr's family, the arrest was a pivotal moment. Although they had lost loved ones over the years and endured decades without answers, seeing law enforcement finally identify the person responsible provided a sense of closure. Yet the emotional impact of the crime and the long wait for justice remained deeply felt. The breakthrough in the Carr case also served as a reminder of the evolving nature of criminal investigations. Techniques that were unavailable in the late 1980s had grown into powerful tools capable of revisiting old evidence and uncovering truths long hidden. For investigators, the success of the case reinforced the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining diligence, no matter how much time had passed. Following the arrest of Todd Joseph Gallant in January of 2024, the wheels of justice began to turn. Gallant was formally charged with first-degree murder and interfering with human remains in connection to the death of Byron Carr. In October of 2024, he entered a plea of not guilty in Supreme Court, setting the stage for a trial that would test both the forensic evidence and the painstaking genealogical work that had identified him. The case drew national attention as Canadians followed the developments in what had been one of the country's most infamous cold cases. As of late 2025, the case remains in pretrial proceedings, with court dates scheduled for various motions. Gallant's defense team has challenged aspects of the DNA evidence, questioning the legality of its collection and the methods used in the genealogical analysis. Meanwhile, Charlottetown police have maintained that the combination of preserved DNA and careful genealogical investigation is reliable and conclusive. They emphasize that the evidence links Gallant directly to Carr's murder, even decades after the crime. For Byron Carr's family, the arrest represents both relief and a bittersweet end to a long chapter of uncertainty. While they never got to see the immediate consequences of the crime in the years following his death, finally knowing the identity of the perpetrator has provided a measure of closure. The decades of fear, unanswered questions, and the emotional toll of living with an unsolved murder have finally been acknowledged through the legal process. The case also raises broader questions about motive. Was Carr's murder the result of a robbery gone wrong, or was it influenced by prejudice against the LGBTQ+ community in 1988? Charlottetown Police Chief Brad McConnell has stated that understanding the full context and motive remains a priority for law enforcement, emphasizing the importance of uncovering the social and personal factors that led to this tragic act. The arrest and ongoing legal proceedings have renewed public interest in cold cases across Canada. Investigators hope that the success of the Carr case, solved through modern forensic and genealogical methods, will inspire renewed attention to other unsolved crimes. It demonstrates that no matter how much time has passed, justice can eventually be pursued, and evidence can speak even decades later. Community members have reflected on the lasting impact of the crime. For Prince Edward Island, a province often seen as peaceful and safe, the murder of Byron Carr remains a stark reminder of vulnerability, fear, and the importance of vigilance. Yet the case also illustrates the resilience of a community committed to seeking justice, no matter how long it takes. The story of Byron Carr is one of tragedy, perseverance, and the slow march of justice. While the scars of the past cannot be erased, the combination of determined investigators, advanced science, and community support has finally provided answers that were once thought impossible. It is a testament to the enduring power of persistence in law enforcement and the relentless pursuit of truth. Even as the legal process continues, the legacy of Byron Carr and the resolution of his case offer hope that no crime, however cold or forgotten, is ever truly beyond the reach of justice. The haunting questions of 1988 are slowly being answered, closing a chapter of fear and uncertainty for the people of Prince Edward Island. In the early morning hours of April 8th, 2006, the farming hamlet of Shedden, Ontario, was still quiet and calm. This was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, a stretch of rural land surrounded by fields and gravel roads. That calm ended when local residents noticed something deeply out of place. Several vehicles were parked together on a remote farm lane, abandoned and silent, as if they had been left in a hurry. When police arrived to check on the vehicles, they made a discovery that would shock the entire country. Inside were the bodies of 8 men. Very quickly, investigators realized this was not a random act of violence and not a robbery gone wrong. All of the men were connected to the same outlaw motorcycle club, the Bandidos. What made the scene even more disturbing was that there were no signs of a struggle where the vehicles were found. This was clearly not where the men had died. Whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to move the bodies and carefully place the vehicles together, almost as if they wanted them to be found. As news spread, police moved to reassure the public. There was no active threat to the community. This was not a feud spilling into everyday life. Instead, authorities made it clear this was an internal crime, something that had happened entirely within the closed world of organized biker groups. That detail only deepened the mystery. If this was not an attack by rivals, then who had killed them and why? To understand how something like this could happen, investigators had to look beyond Shedden itself. The roots of the crime stretched across provinces and back several years. By the early 2000s, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in Canada was struggling. Unlike their powerful rivals, they had fewer members, less influence, and were under constant pressure from police surveillance. Arrests, wiretaps, and ongoing investigations had made trust inside the club fragile and unstable. At the same time, tensions were growing within the organization itself. Different chapters across the country did not always agree on leadership, loyalty, or direction. What was supposed to be a tight brotherhood was quietly breaking apart, replaced by suspicion and power struggles. Loyalty was questioned, motives were doubted. In that environment, even small disagreements could turn dangerous. What police would slowly uncover was that the Shedden murders were not sudden or spontaneous. They were the result of long building fear, ambition, and mistrust inside a criminal group that was turning against itself. The abandoned vehicles in that quiet field were only the final clue to a story that had been unfolding for months, hidden behind closed doors and secret meetings. This was not just a mass murder. It was a betrayal planned from within, carried out by men who once called each other brothers. And the path to that moment began long before anyone in Shedden noticed those vehicles sitting in the cold morning air. Long before the murders in Shedden, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club in Canada was already falling apart from the inside. The club had been brought into the country with big ambitions, but by the early 2000s, it was weak and disorganized. Membership numbers were low, chapters were scattered, and the group lacked the power and influence it wanted. This weakness made internal politics far more dangerous than any outside threat. A deep split had formed between two factions within the club. One side was based mainly in Ontario and included senior members who believed they were the true leadership of the Canadian Bandidos. They saw themselves as loyal to the original values of the club and resisted outside control. The other side was a newer faction tied to the Winnipeg chapter, which was still considered probationary. This group wanted more authority and believed the Ontario members were reckless and damaging the club's reputation. At the center of this growing conflict was control. The Winnipeg group wanted to reshape the Bandidos in Canada and believed that removing the Ontario leadership was the only way to do it. They viewed the existing structure as a liability, especially with police pressure increasing across the country. Surveillance, arrests, and informants were constant fears. With an outlaw biker culture, even a rumor of cooperation with police can be enough to justify extreme action. These fears were not based on proof, but suspicion did not need evidence to grow. Phone taps and investigations targeting the club only added fuel to the paranoia. Members began questioning each other's loyalty. Private conversations were watched. Trust disappeared. Meetings that were once routine became tense and hostile. As this internal struggle intensified, the idea of a decisive solution began to take shape. Instead of dealing with the conflict through discipline or expulsion, some members believed the only answer was permanent removal. The plan that followed was framed as a necessary step to protect the future of the club, a way to cleanse it of those seen as disloyal or dangerous. By the spring of 2006, the divide was no longer just political. It had become personal, secretive, and violent in intent. The stage was set for a meeting that was presented as routine but was designed to end in bloodshed. What the Ontario members believed was an attempt to settle internal issues was, in reality, a carefully planned betrayal that would change Canadian crime history forever. As tensions inside the Bandidos continued to rise, a solution was presented that appeared on the surface to be routine. A mandatory club meeting, known within biker culture as a church meeting, was called to address ongoing disputes. These meetings were meant to resolve internal problems and reinforce loyalty. Attendance was expected, and refusing to show up could itself raise suspicion. For the Ontario members, this meeting seemed tense but necessary. The location chosen was a rural farm property near the small community of Shedden, Ontario. The land belonged to a senior bandido who held an enforcement role within the club. The property was isolated, surrounded by farmland, and far from public view. To those attending, it may have seemed like a secure place to speak freely. In reality, the isolation made it the perfect location for something far more sinister. On the evening of April 7th, 2006, members of the Ontario faction traveled to the farm in separate vehicles. They believed they were meeting fellow club members to settle disagreements and clarify leadership issues. There was no warning that their fate had already been decided. They arrived unarmed or lightly armed, expecting rules of brotherhood to still apply. Unknown to them, several members from the opposing faction were already at the property. Weapons had been gathered, roles had been discussed, and control of the situation had been carefully planned. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was organized, deliberate, and built on weeks of growing mistrust and ambition. Once everyone arrived, the tone of the gathering shifted almost immediately. The meeting did not follow normal procedures. Instead of discussion, the Ontario members were confronted, restrained, and stripped of any authority they believed they still held. In that moment, the idea of brotherhood ended. What was supposed to be a meeting became a trap, and escape was no longer an option. As the night went on, the rural farm became a place of confinement and fear. The victims were held for hours, completely unaware of how the night would end. Outside, the area remained quiet and dark, giving no sign of what was unfolding. By the time the plan moved into its final stage, there was no longer any doubt among the attackers about what they intended to do. The events that followed would turn this hidden farm into the center of one of the most shocking mass murders in Ontario's history. In the early hours of April 8th, 2006, the situation at the farm reached a point of no return. The men who had been brought there under the promise of a meeting were no longer being questioned or confronted. A final decision had already been made. The plan was to eliminate them completely and erase their presence from the club. What followed was controlled and methodical, rather than chaotic. The victims were taken away from the main area, one at a time. The process was quiet and deliberate, carried out by people they had trusted. There was no fight between rival gangs and no sudden explosion of violence. Instead, the murders unfolded as part of a planned internal purge meant to reshape the organization through fear and force. While the killings were taking place, the surrounding countryside remained still. No neighbors heard screams or gunfire that raised immediate alarm. At one point during the night, police officers conducting unrelated surveillance in the broader area were nearby, watching other targets connected to biker activity. They had no idea that multiple murders were happening only a short distance away. By the time the killings were complete, the focus shifted to concealment. The bodies were placed into several vehicles that had been driven to the farm earlier that evening. These vehicles were then driven away from the property in the darkness, forming a quiet convoy moving through rural roads. The vehicles were eventually abandoned together along a farm lane near Shedden. They were left in a way that seemed careless, almost brazen, as if the killers believed discovery was inevitable, but accountability could still be avoided. After leaving the scene, those responsible scattered, returning to different cities and attempting to resume normal life. As daylight approached, the farm returned to silence. What had happened there was hidden from view, but only temporarily. Within hours, the aftermath would be discovered, and the scale of the crime would shock the entire country. Later that same morning, on April 8th, 2006, local residents noticed several vehicles abandoned together along a rural farm lane near Shedden, Ontario. The site was unusual enough that police were called. When officers arrived and looked inside the vehicles, they made a devastating discovery. Inside were the bodies of 8 men. All had been killed only hours earlier. The crime scene quickly became one of the largest mass murder investigations in Ontario history. Investigators moved quickly and determined that the victims were all connected to the Bandidos motorcycle club. Police made it clear to the public that this was not a random act of violence, and that there was no immediate danger to the community. Attention soon turned back to the farm where the men had last been seen alive. Evidence found there, combined with phone records and witness information, pointed directly to members of the same organization. Arrests began within days. Several men connected to the farm and the Winnipeg chapter of the Bandidos were taken into custody. Over time, more suspects were charged as the investigation expanded. The case revealed a carefully planned internal betrayal rather than a conflict with a rival gang. The trial process took years and became one of the most complex criminal proceedings in Canadian history. Testimony from a cooperating insider, along with forensic evidence and surveillance records, laid out a clear timeline of how the murders were planned and carried out. In October of 2009, multiple accused were found guilty of first-degree murder and received automatic life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. Others were convicted of lesser but still serious charges related to the crime. The Shedden Massacre effectively destroyed the Bandidos' presence in Canada. The organization collapsed under the weight of the investigation and convictions. What remained was a lasting reminder of how internal paranoia, power struggles, and loyalty built on fear can lead to unimaginable violence. Today, the case stands as one of Ontario's darkest crimes. 8 lives were lost, not to an outside enemy, but to people they believed were their brothers. The Shedden Massacre remains a chilling example of how trust can be weaponized and how quickly a secretive world can implode from within. Edmonton, Alberta, early June of 2012. On the surface, Travis Baumgartner appeared to be an ordinary young man trying to make a living. At just 21 years old, he had recently started working for the global security company G4S, tasked with transporting millions of dollars safely between banks and ATMs. For his co-workers, he was a quiet presence, someone dependable enough to guard vast sums of cash. But beneath that calm exterior, trouble was quietly building. Baumgartner had been struggling with financial pressures. Debts totaling over $58,000 weighed heavily on him, owed to family, friends, and even his mother. On the night before his final shift, he argued with his mother over money, insisting that he would take care of things, but giving no hint of the violence he had planned. His bank account contained just 26 cents, stark contrast to the wealth he would later seize. Online, he displayed a dark side. While his dating profiles painted him as friendly and easygoing, his social media activity hinted at something more dangerous. Quotes from movies and cryptic posts suggested a fascination with chaos and unpredictability. These signals, subtle as they were, went unnoticed by colleagues and supervisors. On the night of June 14th, Baumgartner reported for his overnight route with a team of 5 guards. Their job was routine: move money securely between ATMs and banks across Edmonton. The crew included Eddie Rajano, the driver, Brian Ilesic and Baumgartner in the back of the armored truck, and Michelle Shigelski and Matthew Schumann following behind in a secondary vehicle. Each member had experience and responsibility, but none suspected that one of their own would turn against them. That evening, Baumgartner carried his standard issue equipment: a revolver, keys to secure areas, and body armor. For most guards, these tools were shields and symbols of trust. For him, they became instruments of betrayal. As the night stretched on and the crew entered their first stops, the stage was set for a violent, calculated act that would shock not only Edmonton, but all of Canada. Even in the quiet hum of city streets and the routine of handling money, the tension was invisible. To everyone else, it was just another shift, another night of work. But in those shadows, a young man with a mounting desperation was preparing to change lives forever. The line between protector and predator had already begun to blur. Just after midnight on June 15th, 2012, the G4S crew arrived at the University of Alberta campus in Edmonton. Their destination was a series of ATMs inside the Hub Mall, a location bustling with students and staff during the day, but silent at night. For Baumgartner and his team, it should have been a routine stop, a simple part of their overnight circuit. The long hallways and empty spaces gave no hint of the horror about to unfold. Inside the secure vault room behind the ATMs, 3 of the guards, Brian Ilesic, Michelle Shigelski, and Matthew Schumann, began servicing the machines. Baumgartner followed, his revolver hidden beneath his jacket, and the vault door closed behind them. The room was small, windowless, and enclosed, leaving the guards completely exposed. Their backs were turned as they worked, focused on the task at hand, unaware of the imminent danger. In a calculated moment, Baumgartner turned on his colleagues. He fired his revolver at point-blank range, targeting each person in the room. The confined space amplified every sound, creating echoes that would later be described as chilling and surreal. He left the vault, closing the door behind him, and proceeded to the armored truck where the driver, Eddie Rajano, was waiting. With cold efficiency, he shot the driver as well, before taking control of the vehicle. Once inside the truck, Baumgartner quickly transferred bags of cash to his own personal Ford F-150, parked nearby. The stolen money totaled over 300,000 Canadian dollars, a fortune for a 21-year-old who had been living paycheck to paycheck. With the truck now abandoned, he sped off into the night, leaving the scene in chaos. Emergency services were alerted when the first 911 calls reported shots fired, and paramedics and police raced to the Hub Mall. Inside the vault, the reality of the attack came into focus. Brian Ilesic and Michelle Shigelski had been killed, while Matthew Schumann survived despite serious injuries. The surviving guard became the key witness, the only person able to provide a description of the attack and the identity of the assailant. The city of Edmonton, already in shock, now faced the frightening truth. The violence had been committed by one of their own, an insider who knew the routines and weaknesses of the armored crew. Police quickly secured the area, collecting evidence and tracing the route of the stolen truck. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras helped establish Baumgartner's movements and direction of escape. The investigation revealed not just a robbery, but a meticulously planned betrayal, a scenario almost unimaginable in its coldness. By the early hours of the morning, the Edmonton Police Service understood the magnitude of what they were dealing with. Travis Baumgartner was now a fugitive, armed and dangerous, and the manhunt had officially begun. The city held its breath, knowing the perpetrator had intimate knowledge of both the crime scene and the security measures in place, making his capture a daunting challenge. As the sun rose on June 15th, 2012, Edmonton was in shock. The initial reports of the G4S shooting painted a picture of a brutal, carefully executed crime, and the reality that the perpetrator was an insider made the situation even more terrifying. Travis Baumgartner, just 21 years old, had become the most wanted man in the city. Police quickly mobilized a coordinated manhunt involving not only the Edmonton Police Service, but also neighboring municipal forces and the RCMP. Investigators had a clear profile. Baumgartner was armed, dangerous, and intimately familiar with the armored vehicle routes and security protocols. Officers established roadblocks and coordinated with highway patrols, checking for any suspicious vehicles leaving the area. The stolen G4S truck had been abandoned hours earlier, but the trail of his personal Ford F-150 led authorities across the city's outskirts. Surveillance cameras, witness statements, and license plate sightings became critical pieces of the investigation, as every detail was analyzed to predict his next move. Meanwhile, Baumgartner was on the run, moving with urgency but aware of the scrutiny. He had over 300,000 Canadian dollars in cash, which made him both a high-risk target and a fugitive with resources to evade capture. His planning extended to small actions meant to confuse authorities, but the extensive media coverage worked against him. News outlets broadcast his photo repeatedly, warning the public that he was armed and extremely dangerous. This attention, combined with real-time law enforcement coordination, kept pressure on him as he attempted to cross provincial lines. As the hours passed, investigators pieced together the timeline of his escape. Baumgartner had initially headed south, using familiar roads to navigate toward the border. Law enforcement focused on likely crossing points, anticipating he might attempt to enter the United States. Border agencies were briefed, watch lists updated, and checkpoints staffed. Meanwhile, police continued collecting evidence from the hub mall, photographing the scene, and cataloging ballistic and security data, which provided a detailed understanding of how the crime unfolded. During this tense period, a critical communication came from Baumgartner's mother. She contacted police to report finding a pile of cash on her kitchen table, roughly $64,000, with a note indicating her son's actions. Her plea for him to surrender peacefully highlighted the desperation surrounding the manhunt. Authorities recognized that family connections might be the key to negotiating his safe capture, but also understood that time was of the essence. By late afternoon, nearly 36 hours after the murders, tips and surveillance led officers to a crossing near Lyndon, Washington, just south of Langley, BC. Baumgartner had reached the border, thinking he could escape. Authorities, having anticipated this move, quietly surrounded the area. Without confrontation, he was apprehended, ending a high-intensity manhunt that had gripped Alberta and Canadian law enforcement. Baumgartner's capture was both a relief and a shock. The young man who had executed a violent robbery and murder spree in minutes was now in custody, carrying a backpack of over $330,000 in cash. The manhunt had demonstrated the speed and coordination of modern policing, but it also underscored the unpredictability of insider crimes. For Edmonton, the city's sense of security had been shaken, and for investigators, the focus immediately shifted to preparing a case that would withstand the scrutiny of the Canadian justice system. After Travis Baumgartner was apprehended near the Lyndon border crossing, on June 16th, 2012, he was quickly transported back to Edmonton to face the consequences of his actions. Law enforcement had gathered overwhelming evidence during the manhunt and the subsequent investigation, including surveillance footage, witness statements, ballistic reports, and the cash recovered from his pickup. Authorities were confident that the case against him would be airtight. Baumgartner was formally charged with 1 count of first-degree murder for the death of Eddie Rajano, 2 counts of second-degree murder for Brian Olesic and Michelle Shigelski, and 1 count of attempted murder for Matthew Schumann. The severity and cold-blooded nature of the crimes drew national attention, with media outlets across Canada covering every development. Public outrage was high, particularly given that Baumgartner had been a trusted member of the security team tasked with protecting his colleagues. During the trial, which began in late 2012, prosecutors presented a detailed timeline of the events, including Baumgartner's financial troubles, his planning, and his actions on the night of June 15th. Matthew Schumann, the sole survivor, provided testimony describing Baumgartner's betrayal, offering crucial insight into how the shootings occurred inside the Hub Mall vault. Forensic experts explained the ballistic evidence and how it matched Baumgartner's revolver, while investigators detailed the recovered cash and the stolen armored truck. Baumgartner ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges, sparing the families the ordeal of a prolonged trial. The court then turned to sentencing, weighing the horrific nature of the crime against Canadian legal standards. In one of the most severe rulings in recent history, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a consecutive parole ineligibility period totaling 40 years. This meant he would not be eligible for parole until he reached the age of 61. The judge described his actions as a cold and calculated betrayal, emphasizing the extreme breach of trust and the devastating impact on the victims' families. At the time, this sentence was unprecedented in Canada, designed to reflect both the premeditation and the magnitude of the crimes. The families of the victims found a sense of justice in the ruling, believing that the length of the sentence appropriately recognized the horror of what had happened. Public response was similarly supportive, with many praising the legal system for holding Baumgartner accountable for a uniquely vicious crime. However, this sense of closure was challenged years later. In 2022, the Supreme Court of Canada issued a ruling in a separate case that declared consecutive parole ineligibility periods unconstitutional, labeling them as cruel and unusual punishment. Because of this decision, Baumgartner's 40-year parole ineligibility was reduced to the standard 25 years. This retroactive adjustment meant he could apply for parole in 2037, significantly earlier than initially expected, reopening emotional wounds for the families. Despite this legal development, Baumgartner remains imprisoned, serving his life sentence for the murders and attempted murder he committed. The case continues to serve as a chilling example of how a single act of betrayal can devastate multiple lives in minutes. It also highlights the complexities of the Canadian justice system and the delicate balance between punishment, legal precedent, and the rights of the convicted. The violent crimes of Travis Baumgartner left a permanent scar on Edmonton and the wider Alberta community. Families of the victims were forever changed, struggling to rebuild their lives after losing loved ones in a single devastating night. Matthew Schumann, the sole survivor, faced years of physical and emotional recovery, living with lasting injuries and the trauma of witnessing the events firsthand. The horror of the night of June 15th, 2012, became a defining moment for all involved. In the weeks following Baumgartner's arrest, public attention focused not only on the crime itself, but also on the vulnerabilities within security procedures. Companies handling armored transport across Canada reviewed and strengthened their safety protocols, aiming to prevent insiders from having unchecked access to cash and weapons. The case prompted discussions on employee vetting, mental health monitoring, and the risks of financial stress leading to desperate actions. Baumgartner's actions also had a profound impact on Canadian legal discourse. The initial 40-year parole ineligibility sentence highlighted how courts could use consecutive sentencing provisions to reflect the severity of multiple crimes. However, the 2022 Supreme Court decision that reduced his parole ineligibility to 25 years sparked debate about the balance between justice for victims and constitutional protections for offenders. Families of the victims publicly expressed their disappointment, calling the change a painful reversal in what had once seemed like absolute justice. The crime itself is remembered for the cold and methodical planning involved. Baumgartner's role as an insider, trusted by his colleagues, armed and in control, amplified the shock and fear surrounding the case. Canadians across the country were reminded that violent crime can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes betrayal is more devastating than random acts of violence. The story continues to resonate in true crime circles, serving as both a cautionary tale and a somber reminder of human vulnerability. Even years later, the families, law enforcement, and community continue to honor the memories of Eddie Rajano, Brian Alesic, and Michelle Shagelski. Their names are remembered in the wake of this tragedy, and advocacy for improved security practices and support for victims' families has grown in response. Meanwhile, Travis Baumgartner remains behind bars, serving his life sentence, a constant reminder of the deadly consequences of greed and desperation. Ultimately, the story of Alberta's horrifying robbery is one of trust betrayed, lives shattered, and justice pursued in the shadow of tragedy. It is a chilling example of how a single individual can turn a routine night into a lasting nightmare, and how the aftermath of such crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims. For the people of Edmonton, and for Canada as a whole, it remains a haunting true crime story that will not be forgotten. On the afternoon of October 19th, 2007, Surrey, British Columbia, felt calm and ordinary. The Whalley neighborhood was busy in the way it always was, with people running errands, heading home from work, and moving through the halls of residential buildings without a second thought. Inside the Balmoral Tower, a high-rise filled with families and working people, life followed its usual rhythm. Nothing about that Friday suggested it would become one of the darkest days in modern Canadian crime history. The Balmoral Tower was not known as a dangerous place. It was a mixed residential building where neighbors passed each other in elevators and hallways every day. Parents raised children there. Workers came and went. Behind its concrete walls, it looked like just another apartment building in a growing city. But hidden behind one door on the 15th floor was a secret that would soon pull innocent people into a violent world they never chose to enter. Apartment 1505 was being used as a drug stash location, tied to a small local group involved in street-level trafficking. This kind of operation was meant to stay quiet and unnoticed. The people involved believed they could blend into normal life without drawing attention. What they did not realize was that their actions had already placed them in the crosshairs of a far more powerful criminal organization operating across the Lower Mainland. At the same time, completely separate lives were unfolding just feet away. A gas fitter named Ed Schellenberg was inside the building doing routine service work. He was a husband and a father, known for being reliable and hardworking. Across the hall, Christopher Mohan, a young man in his early 20s, was at home with his family, thinking about an ordinary afternoon ahead. Neither man had any connection to crime, gangs, or the drug trade. They were simply living their lives in the wrong place on the wrong day. What no one in the building knew was that decisions made weeks earlier had already set a deadly plan into motion. A dispute over control, money, and respect within Surrey's criminal underworld was about to erupt. The violence that followed would not stay contained behind closed doors. It would spill into a residential hallway and forever change the lives of families investigators, and an entire community. By the end of that afternoon, 6 men would be dead, 2 of them completely innocent. The case would become known across Canada as the Surrey 6 Massacre, a crime that exposed how close organized violence can come to everyday life. In the next part, the focus turns to the hidden conflict that led powerful criminals to target a single apartment, and why they were willing to risk everything to send a message. The violence that came to the Balmoral Tower did not begin there. It started weeks earlier within Surrey's drug underworld, where territory and reputation mattered more than life. At the center of the conflict was Corey Lall, a young drug dealer who led a small group operating independently in the city. His crew was not large or especially powerful, but they controlled enough drug sales to draw attention from people who expected obedience. At that time, one of the most feared criminal organizations in British Columbia was the Red Scorpions. They dominated large portions of the lower mainland drug trade through intimidation, strict control, and brutal enforcement. Anyone selling drugs in areas they claimed was expected to pay a fee, often called a tax, in exchange for being allowed to operate. Refusal was seen as open defiance. Corey Lall was approached with a demand from the Red Scorpions to pay a large sum of money so he could continue selling drugs. The message was clear and deliberate. Paying meant survival. Refusing meant consequences. Lall chose not to comply. His decision was viewed as a challenge to the Red Scorpions' authority, something the gang's leadership could not ignore without appearing weak to rivals and associates. The situation escalated further when Lall attempted to expand his operation instead of backing down. This move sent a signal that he believed he could operate outside the control of the dominant gang. In the criminal world, this kind of defiance often ends only one way. For the Red Scorpions, allowing Lall to continue would undermine their grip on power across the region. Behind closed doors, plans were discussed and approved. The goal was not just punishment, but total elimination. The message needed to be unmistakable. This was not about a simple warning or confrontation. It was about demonstrating control through extreme violence, ensuring no one else would consider refusing demands in the future. As these decisions were being made, everyday life continued inside the Balmoral Tower. The people living there had no knowledge of the threat forming beyond their walls. The apartment that would soon become the center of the massacre was already marked as a target, even though innocent lives surrounded it on all sides. By the time the plan was finalized, there was no turning back. The people sent to carry it out were prepared to do whatever was necessary. In the next part, the focus shifts to how that plan was put into motion and how multiple people were unknowingly drawn into a situation they could not escape. On the afternoon of October 19th, 2007, the plan that had been quietly set into motion finally reached the Balmoral Tower in Surrey. The building was busy in the way apartment towers usually are during the day, with the residents coming and going and no visible sign that anything was wrong. Inside one unit on the 15th floor, Corey Lall and several people connected to him were present, unaware that they were being watched and tracked. A man named Sofon CK played a critical role in what happened next. He was not a resident of the building, but he knew both the target and the people planning the attack. SEK was used to gain access to the apartment and ensure the door would open without resistance. His involvement allowed the situation to move from planning into action without drawing immediate attention. Once inside the unit, the attackers took control of everyone already there. The atmosphere inside the apartment shifted instantly from routine to terror. The people inside were restrained and forced to wait, though they had no way of knowing why time was being stretched out or what was coming next. The delay was intentional, as the attackers were waiting for one more person connected to the target. During this period, Ed Schellenberg arrived to do scheduled repair work in the apartment. He was a gas fitter, carrying out a normal job, completely unaware of what had already taken place inside. His arrival placed an innocent worker directly into the center of a violent crime through nothing more than bad timing. Across the hallway, Christopher Mohan stepped out of his own apartment. He lived there with his mother and was preparing to leave for the day. When his door opened, he was confronted and pulled into the neighboring unit. In a matter of seconds, another innocent person became trapped in a situation he had no connection to and no control over. Not long after, Edward Narong arrived at the apartment. His presence marked the final step in the plan. With everyone the attackers intended now inside the unit, the situation shifted again. What had been a controlled holding phase was about to become something far worse. As the door closed behind the last arrival, the attackers moved quickly to finish what they came to do. The events that followed would leave 6 people dead and turn an ordinary apartment into the scene of one of the most shocking crimes in Canadian history. In the next part, the focus turns to how the massacre was discovered and how police were first alerted to what had happened. The massacre remained hidden for hours inside the 15th floor apartment, unnoticed by other residents going about their day. What finally raised concern had nothing to do with noise or visible violence. Outside the building, Ed Schellenberg's work vehicle was still parked where it should not have been. By late afternoon, this stood out as unusual for a job that should have been completed much earlier. The building manager decided to check on the situation. When he approached the unit, the door was partially open. Inside, he saw Schellenberg lying motionless. Fearing a possible gas leak, he did not go further into the apartment. Instead, he pulled the building's fire alarm, forcing residents to evacuate and bringing emergency responders to the scene. When police entered the unit, they quickly realized the scale of what they were dealing with. 6 men were found dead inside the apartment. The scene immediately stood apart from typical gang-related shootings due to the number of victims and the presence of 2 people with no criminal ties. The 15th floor was sealed off as a major crime scene, and the building became the center of intense police activity. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched one of the largest homicide investigations in British Columbia history. Officers canvassed the building, collected surveillance footage, and began identifying everyone who had entered or exited the tower that day. Roads around the area were blocked off as forensic teams worked late into the night. As details emerged, investigators confirmed that the apartment had been used as a drug stash location, pointing to an organized crime motive rather than a random act of violence. This immediately raised concerns that the killings were part of a larger gang conflict unfolding in the Lower Mainland. Police also made it clear that the deaths of Schellenberg and Mohan were being treated as deeply significant, highlighting the danger of gang violence spilling into everyday spaces. News of the massacre spread quickly across Canada. The idea that 6 people could be killed in a residential high-rise in the middle of the day shook the public and drew national attention. Pressure mounted on police to identify those responsible and explain how such an extreme crime could happen without warning. Behind the scenes, investigators were already tracing connections between known gang members, phone records, and past disputes. What they were uncovering pointed toward a carefully planned hit, rather than a spontaneous act. In the next part, the focus shifts to how police unraveled the conspiracy and the long, complicated road toward arrests and accountability. As the investigation continued, police slowly built a case around the people believed to have planned and carried out the killings. The breakthrough came when an insider connected to the crime agreed to cooperate with authorities. This individual provided crucial details about how the attack was organized, who was involved, and why the apartment had been targeted. Their cooperation came at great personal risk and underscored just how dangerous the world surrounding the case truly was. Eventually, 2 men, Cody Havisher and Matthew Johnston, were charged and brought to trial. In the year 2014, both were found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, reflecting the scale and severity of the crime. The convictions marked a major moment for investigators who had spent years piecing together evidence from a tangled web of gang alliances in silence. The legal process, however, was far from straightforward. During the court proceedings, serious issues involving police misconduct were revealed. Several officers connected to the investigation were accused of inappropriate relationships with witnesses, damaging the credibility of parts of the case. These revelations complicated the prosecution and cast a long shadow over the investigation, raising difficult questions about trust, ethics, and accountability within law enforcement. Attention also turned to the man believed to have ordered the killings, Red Scorpion's leader Jamie Bacon. Charges against him faced delays and legal challenges for years. In the year 2017, a judge stayed the first-degree murder charge due to concerns about the integrity of the investigation. Later, Bacon pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and received a significantly reduced sentence compared to those who carried out the attack. For many, especially the victims' families, this outcome felt deeply unsatisfying. The Surrey 6 massacre left a permanent mark on Surrey and on Canada as a whole. It exposed how organized crime could reach into ordinary residential spaces and how innocent people could be caught in the middle without warning. The deaths of Ed Schellenberg and Christopher Mohan became symbols of that harsh reality, showing that gang violence does not stay contained within the criminal world. Years later, the case is still remembered as one of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history. It changed how police approach organized crime investigations and sparked public debate about justice, policing, and the protection of innocent lives. The story of the Surrey 6 stands as a grim reminder that behind every headline are families forever changed and a community left asking how such a tragedy was allowed to happen.